Hello and hi everyone. Thanks for joining our another webinar in a series of webinars we are organizing here in Cloudbit. Um, today, today we will have a very special person with us, and we'll start in a few minutes. Just let's wait for a little bit more people to join. Let's also do a quick sound check, Wesley.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. So I believe our participants can hear as well. Okay, we are almost set. Let's give it another minute and we can just start then. So just, just to start with a quick intro to our guest. Let's see, just we might have some, let's see if people are okay. Okay, yeah, looks like people can hear us. Great. Thanks, Moshe, for indication. Okay, so let's start just with introducing our guest. So today, basically, we are going to talk about test automation best practices. And today we have with us Wesley. Wesley Thijs is a test automation expert, which not just writing tests, but also has quite a scientific approach to test automation frameworks. And today, Wesley is going to overview with us his takeaways from his test automation career so far and give us some basic and some more expert tips. So going to be quite an interesting session. The way we want to structure it today, so we will have about 30 minutes plus minus presentation from Wesley with some practical pieces of code he's going to share with us. And then we will open it up for a Q&A session. So you can also ask questions in between, but I think the best if you can hold off till the end of the Wesley session, and you have two options to ask questions. You can just write them in the chat, or you have a special Q&A section in Zoom. So whatever one you choose, we will try to answer all your questions. And yeah, if you can just hold off and write it aside and then just ask your questions towards the end of Wesley's session. I also want to encourage you to register for our webinars. Towards the end of this webinar, I'm going to share a link with you where you can register for the further webinars. So use the time you. I believe still most of you sitting at home, so you can use this time to learn new things and to enrich your knowledge. And by the way, I hope you all guys are safe wherever you are. We use this time for, it's a great time for do things that you never had time before. So we learn a lot, and we're going to share it with you. Our Cloudbit team and our guests are going to share with you in the course of next few webinars. So definitely keep in touch and register for next webinars as well. Anyway, so I think we are good to go. So I want just quickly to hand it off to Wesley. Wesley has a very interesting session with us today. So Wesley, the stage is yours. Maybe if you can start just with a few words about yourself, and then we can jump into your presentation.
All right. First of all, thank you for having me, Nick. It's really a pleasure to be here. So my name is Wesley Thijs. I work for Avenue. I'm a freelancer, which means that I go to many different companies. I started at a company called Eurofins, and there I went into consultancy, and I had my first assignment at the Lijn. The Lijn is a public transport company here in Belgium, and that's where I had my first real sense of touch with test automation. I started doing performance testing there, and for me, performance testing is just a part of test automation. Only instead of doing an API test once, you do it multiple times in quick succession. So for me, there's not a whole lot of difference. So that's where I started picking up the more technical kind of stuff of software testing. Then I moved on after my assignment was finished to CIPAL. CPAL is responsible for creating all of the software that the municipalities in Belgium use. So if you have to get a new electronic identifying card, you can do that in one of the applications that CPAL created. Over there, we had to have multiple layers of, we had to choose a new test automation framework because there was one already, but there was one for just a small part of the project and the other projects weren't automated yet. So we had to create a whole new framework over there. And we chose for a multi-tier approach. What I mean by that is we had a common framework and we had different frameworks for the projects that would inherit from the common framework. In our common framework, we would have some common items, as the name suggests. We would have stuff like date generators, random data generators, all the stuff that would be shared across different projects would go into that specific project and then would be inherited by the different test automation frameworks. After my, sorry, I forgot a part. So after a while, we wanted to switch front-end technologies. We chose AngularJS. Now Angular is promise-based, so we had to choose a test automation framework that also worked based on those contracts. And we went with Protractor there. So we had to do a whole case study, which was better Selenium versus Protractor. We weighed the advantages versus the disadvantages of both frameworks. And we came to the conclusion that Protractor was the better choice, even though we had a big collection of Selenium tests already. So that's my assignment ended when we started implementing that framework. So I went to a different company again. This time I went over to the Vlaamse Overheid. In the Vlaamse Overheid, I started doing test automation again. This time more in dev. I was more responsible for the structure of the testing because we had a lot of test automation already, but it was a lot of flaky tests. So it was again in Protractor, and it was my responsibility to make sure flakiness didn't happen as much. After a while, if your tests keep turning red because of flakiness, now maybe also you guys probably know, but just to be clear, flakiness, when I say that, what I mean is a test that fails for a random reason. For example, a call that lasts maybe a second too long, where it would last normally 30 seconds, it will last now 31 seconds, and that might cause a timeout. So there's a flaky test for me. There are different ways to handle those kinds of tests, and I was responsible in that specific framework for handling those kinds of tests and making sure that the right tests were executed on the right test level. We were a strong proponent of the testing triangle. So the testing triangle states that you have to do unit testing wherever possible and do your automated testing wherever suitable, because unit tests are pretty cheap to make. They're pretty close to the source. And your higher level tests, of course, they are more expensive to make because they break more often, more flaky, more steps required, etc. So after a while, my assignment ended there as well, and I went over to Argenta, the bank in Belgium, where I currently still work at. And right now we do a lot of mobile automation as well. I'm not really 100% responsible for the mobile automation anymore, but I did help set it up. So the mobile automation part involves a lot of Appium testing, where I used to do a lot of Selenium testing. I'm now also involved with some Appium testing. We had a lot of worries that we had to take into account. And whenever there's a big problem, I still have to solve it. So that's kind of my responsibility at the moment. Thank you, Nick. That was my story.
Okay, thanks, Wesley, for a background and overview. So I will hand off to you now the screen sharing, and so you can go ahead with your presentation and share your screen. Let me just stop my sharing. Yep, the stage is yours.
All right, let's see if everything's all right. You should see my screen right now.
Yeah, we do.
Let me start at the first slide. That would be better. All right, there we go. So let's start. All right. First of all, I'm going to give you guys a bit of an overview of what we're going to see today. I divided my presentation into two different subtopics. For me, there's a lot more. I chose general topics and mobile automation. Of course, you also have web automation, embedded device automation. There's a lot of different topics, but we only have 30 minutes here, and I wanted to give you guys some valuable tips. So I just stuck to these topics. In the general topics, we're going to talk a little bit about page object models, which is a design pattern, which I'll go into detail a little bit more about later. We'll go into retry mechanisms, which is also a design pattern. A lot of people have asked me, if I have my automated testing, should I write unit tests for my automated testing? That's a good question if you ask me. And writing testable code, which is a programming principle, is something we as test automators should also implement, in my opinion. When we speak specifically about mobile automation, we'll talk more about compatibility issues. The use of interfaces to catch differences between Android and iOS versions. Sometimes the OS requires that you implement a feature in a specific way, and that way can differ between Android and iOS. How can you deal with that difference? And having a stable device farm, that's also a really important part for me. We used to have our own device farm. Now we do everything in the cloud, so really important part. Now, first, let's start about page objects. I included a diagram for you just to illustrate what a page object is. A page object is pretty much just, you don't really have to pay too much attention. For you guys who want to know, a page object is pretty much a separate class. That page object contains all of the UI elements and all of the tests for those elements. Now, this design pattern is really important, because when you make a change to your application under test, and you have 500 different test cases that use a component for that application under test, you're going to have to change those 500 tests if that component changes. Now, when we go back to our page object and we see that it's a separate class containing UI elements, and your test cases reference that class, so that means that when your application under test changes, only one class has to change as opposed to the 500 tests you used to have to change before. This may all seem a little bit abstract, but I'm going to give you guys an example in Oxygen IDE as well. Now, there is also a disadvantage to using page objects. So we just saw the advantage. There's also a big disadvantage. It adds an extra layer of complexity. Now, when I go back to my slide about the page objects, the diagram specifically, you can see that I need to, in my test object, create my driver, and then I need to pass that driver along to my page object. I need to process the operation, and I need to send back the results. And then in my test object, I can do my assertion. It adds an extra layer of complexity. In my humble opinion, this extra layer of complexity is very much worth it, because you get a lot of maintainability instead of a little bit of complexity. So that's why I always am a big proponent of page objects. Now, when we move on to the implementation of page objects, you might be wondering, how should I implement this? I've designed a general pattern for you guys. This is not something particular to a specific technology. So there are different nuances to the technology you might be using. But the general flow that I would use is, I would first review an overview of the flow between my screens. So I would note down every screen and to what other screen that screen connects. Then I would create a page class for every screen that I noted down. And then for every connection between those pages, I make sure that one page returns that page to another page. I'm going to give you guys an example, because this might seem a little bit abstract. Say, for example, you're ordering something online, you're ordering food. So on the first page, you have to enter your order details. And then on the second page, you have to enter your address. So you have to pass the order page to the address page object, because you have to use specific values from that address, from that previous page in the address page. And then when you have all of those pages and all of those different connections between the pages implemented, you can start implementing your test classes. those are going to perform your operations on your page objects. So that's all very abstract. I'm also going to be showing you guys this in Oxygen. So here is my Oxygen, which I have opened now. I have two scripts in here. First is basic.js. Now a few steps in here. Web.init is just going to initialize my web API. Now web.open is going to open my web page. And then I'm just going to select the window that has the title Google, just to make sure I'm on the right page. Then I'm just going to generate a random date, and I'm going to enter it in the question field, in the search field, and I'm going to click OK. So when I run this test, you guys gonna see that my browser is starting up. There we go, and it's going to enter the date, and it's going to start Google. So there we go, that was my test case. Now say for example, I have 2 or 3 different test cases. I made a different file in here. And as you can see, I created a page object inline in the same file in here. This is, you guys probably shouldn't do it inline. Oxygen has out of the box options to create page objects. You can just put this in a different file and then export that file and require it in here. But I just did this in inline to make it more obvious for the testing, so it's better to show, easier to show. So this is going to do the same thing. It's going to initialize the WebDriver. It's going to open Google, going to enter the date, and then it's going to do the same thing again. It's going to initialize the WebDriver, open Google, go to Google, and then it's going to query my name, and it's going to press the search button. The only difference now is that I have 2 fields in here, search button, 2 functions, search button and input query. And now I've done it in 2 different ways. So I have web.findElement in here, and I can just use this to click on the specific element that I need to. So when I run this code, as you can see, it's going to use my page object, and it's going to run this tests using the page object. First the date test and then my name. There we go. So that is a demonstration of page objects in Oxygen. I really like this IDE, by the way. If you guys want more information, I'm sure we can give you more information at the end of the talk. So let's move back to the presentation. There we go. Now, moving on to retry mechanisms. Also a really important design pattern, if you ask me. Now, first, let me demonstrate why. So first, you're going to start with a few test cases, maybe 10, maybe 20. They're going to grow over time. You're going to get 100, maybe 200, 300, 400 test cases. And you need to run them for compatibility on many different browsers. So maybe 5, 6, maybe even 12 browsers, depending on your CPU and your configuration. You need to run a couple of hundreds of tests on 12 different browsers, and they're gonna have tens of steps each. So as you can see, that adds up to huge amounts of possibilities for failure. Those possibilities for failure don't always have to mean that your application under test is wrong. It can just be a small hiccup in the system. And that's what we call flakiness. So you're going to have to deal with this flakiness in some way. That's why I always suggest a retry mechanism. Now it will have some advantages, such as reducing flakiness. And you can also just record which tests have a lot of reruns. You can look at that report later and you can make sure that you pick out the ones that rerun a lot, so you can pick the flaky tests out. But it will of course slow down your test suite. And you can't determine exactly with how much time it will slow down your test suite. That is because it's going to retry only when it fails, and it's going to retry it X amount of times. So for example, I have a code example here as well. Don't try this at home. This is really important. This is just bad coding, but I did it as an example. I just wanted a few lines of code. So you do your retry 3 times in here. As you can see, I have an integer int retry is equals 3. While true, I try to do something and I break if it's successful. If an error happens, I just retract a retry and I wait for 1 second and I just try again. So this code retries 3 times. If my test fails 2 times, it's going to have to retry 2 times. If it fails 3 times, it's going to have to retry 3 times. If you have hundreds of tests, and 50 tests fail, it's going to have to retry 50 tests, which is going to add 50% of your time. If 70% of your tests fail, 70% will be retried, so you'll have 70% extra. So that's the big disadvantage, is you're going to add an unpredictability about the timing aspect. For some companies, that can be very important. And for some, they say, okay, if it's a flaky test, it's a bad test. Just rewrite it. We have to do something different. It's all dependent on the strategy, but I've seen retry mechanism be an outcome often in the past. So maybe it can help you as well. Now, a question I also get asked often is, should I unit test my test automation or not? I have an opinion about this. Of course, for me, it's very important that you only do useful testing. So don't go testing your test steps, don't go testing your test method. Only test what's really important, and only if it really matters. So only when, for example, I'm going to refer back to my time at CPAL, we had a shared project there. So when you have shared projects, it's pretty important that you have the correct unit tests. So there it is important when you have a single project, nobody else is working on it, and you have mostly test steps. Of course, it's not that important. It might be depending on the criticality of your application, of course, and only do it in common resources and things that you're sure cannot fail, of course. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to that as well. I'll give you guys an example first. So when should you write a unit test, in my opinion? For example, if you have functionality that is shared between all common projects, to generate a random birth date, to generate a random phone number, to generate random names, those need to have a particular structure. So for example, a date must be day / month / y. So you have your date format, and you could write a unit test to test that the format is always correct. That way, if somebody decides to make a change and that change is not according to specifications, you'll have some test saying that there's an error going to happen. Now, you shouldn't write your unit tests for cucumber scenarios, for shared test steps, for all that kind of stuff. Of course, you can't even unit test that, in my opinion. So the disadvantage, I'm going to go back real quick, of unit testing, of course, is that you need to write your specifications and you need to think about your automated test cases. You need to think about what you really need. And of course, it costs more money because you're also writing more test cases. So it costs more time, and time is money. Now, another principle I really like from developing is writing testable code. Now, what I mean by that is, for me, it's a principle from unit testing. It applies to your API, it applies to your UI testing. Every test that is written, in my opinion, has to be a bit testable as well, because your code has to be well structured, your code has to be runnable without dependencies, and you have to initialize a clean system before running. Now, I'm going to go into all three of those topics a little bit as well. For me, it's important that your test automation code follows the coding structure of your project. That way, when something goes wrong in your test automation, when a test fails, you can lead it back to a component in your programming easier. That way you can also look at what's going wrong a bit easier, maybe. It's also easier for other people to go looking through the code and find the methods that they need if it's structured properly. Now, it needs to also be runnable without dependencies, because for me, a dependency is an integration point. And integration points, they give a point of failure extra, and that's what you have to avoid flakiness. If you're speaking about API tests, that's important. But if you're speaking about UI tests, that's even more important. If you don't operate without dependencies, you could have a lot of trouble, because if one of the dependencies decides to add 1 second to their allowed timeout, and you are not informed about that extra timeout, your system is not going to be configured properly to handle that extra dependency. So you might have errors that you're not expecting to get at that point. It's also important for me that you initialize a clean system before you run. Now, what I mean by that is you need to have your test data in order. You need to have the proper versions of what you want to test on the test system. You need to have everything in order before you start running. Otherwise, it's not really that useful. If you have wrong test data, of course your tests are going to fail. If you're testing against the wrong version of the application, of course they're going to fail. So that was writing testable code. For me, let's move on now to mobile automation. One of the things with mobile automation that I have seen in the past, and especially now, is compatibility issues. We had to devise a real solid strategy to test for compatibility issues because that's a major headache for us. There are a lot of different things that you have to take into consideration. First of all, but for me, one of the most important factors is, do you want to do your testing on a real device or do you want to do it in a simulator? This is also why I really like Oxygen IDE. They have built-in support for Genymotion with over 140 different simulators that you can just out of the box select and play on. It's really, they have close integration with other different providers of cloud services for running your tests. So that's one of the things I really like about them. Now, one of the things that we had to take into consideration was which OS version do we support. For example, Android recommends that you go back 3 versions from the current version, but we couldn't just kick 10,000 customers from our current application. So we had to think of another way to support all the versions. And that's where Oxygen could help, because we can just select an older version of Android and iOS, and we can just run our testing. But it's something you have to take into consideration regardless of what you're using. Also, something really important in some applications, not all of course, is software compatibility. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, you can have an antivirus software installed on your the mobile device, and that antivirus software can interfere with your application. It can speak to certain files that are not it can hold on to certain files that your application also needs. So that might be important. Some applications use GPS systems. That might also be important because not all GPS systems are created equally, especially on Android. The camera system might be something you have to integrate with. And those are all things you have to take into consideration. Now, what's also important, of course, is hardware compatibility. You can have different screen sizes that is important, because when you test your application on a mobile phone, it might be completely different from a tablet. Those screen sizes are different, the screen ratios are different, and that's something you, of course, have to take into consideration as well. Now, those are real headaches. You could choose to do cloud testing, or you could choose to go for a local device farm. I'll go deeper into detail about local device farms as well, because there are some points you have to take into consideration on those as well. Now, on to interfaces to catch differences between iOS and Android. Sometimes Android and iOS require a different implementation of the same feature. When they do, it's really important that your test cases are created properly, because otherwise you're going to run into flaky tests and you're going to have issues. Now, what I usually recommend when you have that kind of situation is that you start working with interfaces. So I'm going to give you a very, very basic example. You can have a fruit and an implementation of that interface fruit. So fruit has all the properties all fruits have. And then you have implementations like apple and kiwi. Apple can have a different property from kiwi. For example, hairiness on apple is no. Apples don't have hairs on them. They shouldn't have. Otherwise, you should probably throw it away. And a kiwi, of course, does have hairs on it. So those are. Now, for your mobile test, you can also have that mobile test interface, which will have the test cases that are equal for both Android and iOS. Or you can have your iOS, and you can also have your implementation in iOS and your implementation in Android, where the differences will be implemented in those separate class files. So that's another way you can handle flakiness a little bit. And what's really important, of course, is having a stable device farm. When you pick a local device farm, there are several different things you have to take into consideration. First of all, you have to take energy consumption into consideration. Of course, those devices are going to eat energy. Do you want to pay for that energy? Do you want to outsource it? You have to make sure that you can provide that energy. For example, not all USB hubs are created equally, and you can have a USB hub that cannot power tablets all at the same time, so you might have a problem. You have to think about your device drivers and your test orchestrators. Are you in the same room? Because of course your test devices need to be connected physically to your test device, to your test orchestrators. Do you want to buy or rent your devices? You have to, of course, store them safely. If you buy the latest iPhone XS or XR or whatever it is, you have to make sure that it's safe. It's, of course, an expensive device. There's going to be some wear on the devices because people might be picking them up. There might be scratches. So when you rent a device, you have to make sure that they're in proper state when you return them. When will you replace your outdated devices? How will you do it? What's your strategy? As you can see, a lot of headaches, or you could just pick a cloud solution, which is always my favorite. Now, of course, it's not just as simple as picking a simple cloud solution. You have to make sure that you pick the right cloud solution. You have to make sure that there is connectivity between the app and your backend, between the test device and your backend. So there are some challenges. It's not just as simple as saying we're going to cloud provider right now. So that was my presentation. I always say test automation is like a fine wine. The more mature it gets, the better. Test automation always starts out janky and wanky, and when you set it up, it's always going to be a bit of a mess. But over time, you grow into it, and when you have a proper plan, it always helps, of course. So thank you for watching. We'll be taking some questions now. I also have my contact details on screen. Nick, I'm going to give the word back to you for a moment.
Yeah, if you can just keep your contact details so participants can just write them down or just make a screenshot. Anyway, I do encourage you to check out Wesley's YouTube channel and approach him through various other channels he mentioned. Thanks again, Wesley. Great presentation and very important tips from straight from the field. So you live these things every day, and it's very important, I think, for our audience to hear and share. Some are common concerns, and some are, more particular ones, which some of us need, some not, on everyday basis. But I think more personal experience we can share, more efficient we all can be, and prevent doing the same mistakes and reinventing the wheel. So thank you again very much for this very informative session.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, same. Thanks for joining and preparing this great presentation. So, guys, we are open for questions. Feel free to ask it in either in chat, or you have a special Q&A icon below the main screen in Zoom. So both ways are fine. I have just meantime, while guys you might be just preparing for a few questions, I have few questions on my own, Wesley, that came up to me. So we have a first question, but I just want to start up with my question, if you will allow, and then we can go back to participants' questions. So few things, during your presentations that I noticed to myself, and would really like to hear more, if you can elaborate. So just out of curiosity, you mentioned protractor tests and Selenium. Can you be more specific why you went with Proctractor over Selenium? What advantages you saw? Are those stability issues you saw there? It's easier to solve in Proctractor? Is more, speed that you were able to develop the scripts? It's quite a popular framework here, and generally I think, we hear more and more about alternatives, Selenium alternatives, such as, for example, Cypress and others. So it will be very interesting to hear your take on this.
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Nick. So why we chose for Protractor in particular is that AngularJS, at the time we were switching, and still of course, is it uses a promise-based system, which means that it can work asynchronously. Now, Selenium out of the box cannot simply work asynchronously. We had to, at the time of when we were doing the conversions, we had to write a whole module that could do the asynchronous calls, and Protractor came built in with those possibilities. Now, we also created a POC where we would set up one of those modules so we could do the asynchronous request, because we already had over 1,200 test cases. So we were thinking it would be a shame if we had to waste these. But we noticed quickly that Protractor had thought about all of the things that we didn't think about. So we came across a few issues. For example, we had to use the right kind of weights, so we could we weren't waiting too long, we weren't waiting too short, because you have explicit and implicit, sorry. Whereas where an explicit wait will wait explicitly for an issue to appear for a maximum amount of seconds, and an implicit wait will cut off after a few seconds. So we were able to we didn't have to worry about any of those problems when we started using Protractor. However, when we wanted to use Selenium, we had to use the right kind of weights. So we decided to just go with the solution that already had thought about all of the problems that we could have, and we just went with that.
Right. Okay. Thanks for more specifics. I think this might be important for especially for those who still are thinking which framework to choose. So I think just to summarize it, that Protractor works well and plays well with Angular. And so, guys, you know, again, if you are in a stage where you're thinking to either switch frameworks or maybe just to do some particular work for a particular Angular application, you know, this is something to consider. So, and also feel free to approach Wesley. I'm pretty sure he will be very helpful to share his experience on this. Okay, we have two questions basically here from attendees so far. So the first question is, with page object model for mobile automation, how can I return the next page if the page class interface abstract class? We can't create an instance for it. I don't know if you, do you see Wesley's questions in Q&A session?
I'm open as well. So.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we're going to mark it as answer live. So yeah, I mean, if you can answer this, please go ahead.
Return next page classes interface. Abstract class, we can't create an instance for it. What I would do in that case is just, let me think real quick. I think I would probably create a global variable for the page object. We used to do this with, I have to go back a little bit. When we encountered this issue, we use, I forgot the name, but I think it was abstract classes is when you use. Can I come back to that?
Yeah, sure. You can, if you like, you can stop sharing your screen if you want to, you know, search it out or anything. So feel free just to press.
I'm going to pause my share real quick.
Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen, no worries. And I can read you the next question. And in meantime, if you want to check, and we can come back later to this. No problem.
Yeah, I'm going to open some code. This is private code from my project.
Yeah. So just feel free if you want to stop sharing or if you have another screen. Okay, I will move in meantime. So we'll get back to this question in a moment. I will move to meantime in another question we have here. So the question basically is about CI/CD integration and running test automation in CI/CD. And the question is, if you, from your experience, ever needed or know how to basically divide tests in between different suits in a way so they will run in parallel, but they will finish at the same time. So basically, the question sounds like, have you ever faced a situation when you want to divide your test suits between your runners evenly so they all end at the same time, like the peanut butter strategy? If so, how did you solve it? So I guess the question is about when you have parallel testing and you have, say, a number of runners or slave machines, and you know, the tests are usually in some way are divided, usually automatically. You know, if you ever encourage the need to kind of more precise or fine-tune parallel mechanism or anything like this.
Yeah, we have encountered those kinds of solutions and those kinds of issues in the past. Of course, for example, the first issue that comes to mind is when you register, you have to register for an application. That's the first test case you have to do, and your second test case is going to have to wait for that. So it of course depends on your test orchestrator how you're going to solve this issue. It is pretty relevant if you ask me. You want to divide your runners evenly so that sorry, I think I understand the question wrong. So if I really want to divide all of my test cases between my test runners, if they have to end about at the same time, I just use it depends on the testing framework that you're using, of course. So TestNG has some built-in solutions for that. You can use those. If you use JUnit, that's going to be a little bit harder, but you can always parallelize your tests. So TestNG parallelizing tests cases is what I would recommend you Google for that. I don't know the exact methodology, of course. I always Google it myself. If I want to divide specific test suites between runners, I would just use a tagging strategy. So I would have my different test classes. I would tag those different classes, and then when I use my test runner, so for example, JUnit or TestNG, those have methods that you can use to determine which tags to run and which tags not to run.
Great point. Great point. Yep.
That's one of the methods that you can use for that.
Yeah, great point. I think tags are, you know, it's very flexible solution which can be used in many ways. So yeah, great point. And I think in most of frameworks you can always implement your own runner or your own orchestrator. So, you know.
That as well. That's also an option. That's also going to add a bit of complexity, but it's not that hard anymore. You know, it used to be a lot harder.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Okay, thanks for this. I will mark it as answered. Do you want me to go ahead and ask another question, or you have an answer for the previous one?
Yeah, sure. Could you ask one more question, please?
Yeah, sure. So really just, you know, it's interesting. I think, you know, many companies now go mobile first, and I think, you know, it's just pure web technology doesn't make any sense anymore without some kind of mobile front end. Either it can be a responsive website or mobile app. I mean, most of us spending time being remote and mobile. So just a question here, you know, you mentioned moving from local devices to kind of cloud-based mobile farm. And I think many organizations now undergoing this kind of change. Some already did, some in progress, some have both cloud and on-prem. So just interesting to get your view here, you know, as a transformation. I think it's always a concern, you know, on one side, the benefit, I guess, of cloud-based solution is that you have much more devices offer and much more variety of devices that you could get locally. On the other side, many, you know, many of my fellows have concerns about the speed and stability of cloud devices in cloud. What's your take on this? I mean, is it really you think possible to move completely to cloud? Do you still want to keep your local devices, and you know how it works, how it worked for you, and what your take from it?
So for me, it's pretty obvious. I would, in most cases, suggest that you move on to the cloud unless that there is a security requirement. like you indicated, there's probably some speed issues because your connection isn't going to be the same. But for me, those issues in current days aren't really that big of an issue. Mostly, this will happen when your test set gets way too big. And at that point, I think it might be time to ask yourself if it really is intended that you have that big of a test set in your UI and API test cases. So maybe it's better to move some test cases to a lower level, like unit or integration testing. If your test cases get way too slow when you run them on the cloud versus locally. Now, of course, local is always good for some security, as I said. When you can't have your app running in the cloud, some companies can't have that. It's really an issue to move it there because of personal identifiable information sometimes, especially with GDPR these days. We cannot just put our data anywhere, so we have to be really careful with what we do. In those cases, you really have to look at your devices locally, of course.
Right, right. But the future is in cloud, right?
Sorry?
The future is in cloud, right?
Yeah, for me, it really is. I moved all of the things I have to cloud. It's really because one of the big advantages for cloud for me as well is that you can just spin up new devices whenever you want. You don't have to be bound to your set of devices at any given time.
Yeah, okay, good point. We have another question about APIs. Is there an easier way to track API requests that called from a mobile UI actions than using Fiddler? So I guess the question is about, you know, how you record or how you basically, monitor requests that are generated while you do some test automation on mobile UI. I mean, I have an answer for this, but, you know, please go ahead if you have your own feedback.
Yeah, so I have pretty much two solutions for that. Yeah, sorry, for, Olivier van der Velde, that you can't see my screen. I'm looking at some private code right now. So there are two answers.
I can see your screen, by the way. I still see contact details presentation. So maybe, Oliver, so maybe just Wesley will pass it to the chat shortly after he answers this question, okay?
Excellent. So
yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Wesley.
For me, I can answer this from my hacking experience. I'm also an ethical hacker in my free time. There are a few different ways. So if you're, for example, testing a web application or a mobile application, you can use Burp Suite. That's a web application proxy, and every request that you make and you send through the proxy gets recorded. So when you make an API call via the website, you can record the specific request via the proxy. You can also there are options that you ask your developers to, for example, make Swagger documentation available. Or if you really want a pretty easy way, you can just use the developer console for Chrome or Firefox. Internet Explorer as well, but I'm not as familiar with that one. So I usually just use the Firefox or Chrome one, but you can just use, I'm going to cast my screen real quick here. So I'm going to google.com. No, there we go. You guys can probably see my screen right now. So I'm going to the developer console, inspect. And now when I click my network tab, when I make any call, as you can see, I have a few filter options in here. So I can just click XHR, and this means XHR and fetch. So this will mean all my AJAX calls for the API endpoints will be in here. As you can see, the /complete endpoint will be spoken with this specific query string.
Wesley, I think the question was more about mobile application.
For mobile specifically, this also works, but you of course have to do some more ethical hacking. For mobile, we use I think it's the built-in in Android Studio. When you use the emulator, you can also just look at the code that's running in the background. You can also use ADB for Android, which is the Android debugger bridge. And for iOS, I'm not that familiar. Maybe you also have something to add to that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, what you could use, I will paste it in the chat. I think one of most popular option is to set up it called browser mob proxy. So there are a number of proxy solutions. So what you could do, yeah, I'm just posting it into the chat. You could just set up a browser mob solution so you can change your device browser settings, no browser, sorry, proxy settings. And this way, any communication will go through proxy. So every action you do will be actually captured by the proxy, and then you can export it as HAR format, which is kind of standard format to keep HTTP communication. You can view it anywhere, or you can implement it in your further process. So this is the first thing. Another option is, it depends, you know, if you just want to see the kind of URLs or you want really to see the traffic itself. So if you just want to see the URLs and say HTTP status, so one of the things you could do is ask developers to write this into your application logs. And today Appium is actually coming out of box with an option to gather logs, the device logs, I mean, and include them in your test results or your test report. So this way you don't need to set up proxy and you don't need to be dependent on proxy. You can just, you know, rely on the logs that developers write to the application log and just attach them to your main report. So this is two options I see. By the way, the reason, you know, one of the things that why I know this is because we at Cloudbit implemented it out of box. So, you know, whenever you run tests in Cloudbit, we automatically gather this type of information. And what we do behind the scenes is exactly as I said. We set up a proxy, we change automatically device proxy settings. So all the communication goes through proxy. You need to pay attention, by the way, about certificates if this is HTTPS communication. But you know, you can pretty easily set it up, and then you get all the communication that your application generates. Okay. Hope this answers the question. Cool. Yeah. Wesley, you want to get back to the page objects?
Sorry, I haven't really had time.
No worries. I mean, no worries. I mean, you guys, let's take it offline. You have Wesley's contact details.
Yeah, what I'm going to do for you, FSD, if you want, you have my contact details. You can send this question to me via email, and I can look into it for you. I can't really answer it right now on the spot, but I can definitely look into it for you.
No worries. So Wesley, just if you can paste maybe this, you know, the last slide as a text into the chat, because some people might not see your screen. I don't know, at least one of our participants reported it. So if you can just paste in the chat, and we will let another minute for everyone to stay. Yeah, guys, it's right now in Zoom chat of this session, so just feel free to copy. We will also send you, by the way, we will send you the presentation probably next day or two to the emails you registered with. So you will get the presentation with the contact details as well. Okay, guys, I just towards the end, so thanks for sharing your screen. Wesley, if you can just stop sharing it, I want to take it over. And I just want to show you quickly our I just want to show quickly our new webinar page where you guys can just go ahead and register for the upcoming webinars. So all you need to do is just go to cloudbit.io/webinars. And in the coming days, we'll be releasing next more and more webinar dates. So as you can see already, the next one is the next week. It's a oxygen workshop and selenium workshop, free of charge 2-hour workshop where you can learn how to get started with selenium and end-to-end testing. And oxygen, of course, this is our open source end-to-end testing framework. Some more cool stuff coming up in the coming weeks. We'll talk about Cucumber and best practices of implementing Cucumber in your organization. We will talk about WinUpDriver and Windows Desktop app automation. We will talk about cloud providers. By the way, Wesley, speaking about moving to cloud, so we will have a separate webinar where we'll review 4 major devices and browsers and cloud providers. And more things are coming up. So really interesting topics. We picked up some which will be led by me, and we will have some also guests. So stay tuned. Subscribe to our newsletter on cloudbit.io website. Join our webinars. Stay in touch. If you have any questions to me or to Wesley, again, you will get the presentation with both of us contact details. Thank you again for your participation and spending this hour with us. Keep safe. Enjoy, the time out of office as much as you can, and meet you on the next webinars. Wesley, thanks again to attending and investing your time in preparing the presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an honor.
Thanks, Wesley. Have a great rest of the evening or morning, depends where you are. And meet you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.